I regret abandoning my autistic son. 40 years later, I finally told him the truth. I was only 23 years old when I made the decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. My son Michael was born with autism in 1973, and I couldn't handle it. I was young, scared, and completely unprepared. So I did something unforgivable. I left him in the care of his grandmother and disappeared without a word. For 4 decades, I never looked back. I built a new life, got married again, had other children, and pretended that day never happened. But time has a way of forcing us to face the truth. When my past finally caught up with me, I discovered something that changed everything I thought I knew about my son, about myself, and about the meaning of redemption. This is the story I've been too afraid to tell for 40 years. Before I can explain how all this happened, it's very important that you like and subscribe to the channel. That will help us a lot. Only then can we continue. Our future is in your hands. Now let's get back to this incredible story. My name is Margaret, and I'm 72 years old. I'm sitting in my living room in Pasadena, California, on a Tuesday morning in October, and my hands are shaking as I prepare to tell you this story. For decades, I've carried this secret like a stone in my chest, and it's gotten heavier with every passing year. I've never told anyone the full truth. Not my second husband, not my therapist, not even my priest. But now, as I face the final chapters of my life, I realize that silence has become a burden I can no longer bear. It all started in 1973, in the spring of that year, when I was just a girl, really. I was only 23 years old, newly married to a man named Robert, and I thought I had my entire life figured out. I thought I knew what being a wife meant, what being a mother would mean. I was so wrong about everything. When Michael was born that May, something in me broke. The doctors told us early on that he was different, that he had autism, though back then we didn't use that word the way we do now. They just said he was difficult, that he might never speak properly, that he might never be independent. I remember sitting in that hospital room, looking at my newborn son, and feeling nothing but terror. Robert was devastated, but he tried to be strong. I watched him struggle with the reality of what our lives would become. But I couldn't struggle. I couldn't stay. I couldn't accept that my life had changed so drastically in a single moment. I was selfish. I was immature. I was broken in ways I didn't understand. So when Michael was just 4 months old, I made a decision that would define the rest of my existence. I called my mother in Santa Monica and asked her to take him. Just for a little while, I said. Just until I figured things out. Robert didn't want me to do it, but I was stubborn and desperate and entirely convinced that this was temporary. It was never temporary. I left Michael with my mother, and then I left California altogether. I told Robert I needed time to myself, that the pressure of being a mother was suffocating me. I left him a note. Can you imagine a note? And I drove to Arizona with barely any money and no plan. I was running from my responsibilities, from my pain, from a reality I couldn't face. And for the next 40 years, I lived with the consequences of that choice, though I didn't fully understand the magnitude of what I had done until very recently. This is the story of how I abandoned my son. This is the story of how I finally came home. The first few months after I left were a blur of cheap motels and waitressing jobs. I worked at a diner in Phoenix, Arizona, living under a fake name, Margaret Sullivan instead of Margaret Harris, as if changing my identity could change what I had done. I was 1973 turning into 1974, and I was running from a reality that felt too heavy to carry. Every morning I woke up in those dingy rooms with water stains on the ceiling, and for a few blessed seconds I would forget about Michael. Then the memory would crash down on me like a wave, and I would have to start the day all over again, pretending I was someone else, someone who hadn't abandoned her newborn son. My mother called the diner a few times that first year. I remember standing behind the counter, my hands frozen, listening to her voice on the phone. She was begging me to come back, telling me that Michael needed me, that Robert was devastated, that I was destroying everything I had built. But I couldn't go back. I wasn't strong enough. I was drowning in my own cowardice, and I thought that if I just stayed away long enough, the guilt would fade. It never did. Guilt is a clever thing. It doesn't fade with distance. It grows roots. It settles into your bones. After about 18 months in Phoenix, I met a man named David at the diner. He was a truck driver passing through town, and he was kind to me in a way that felt like salvation at the time. He didn't ask too many questions about my past, and I was grateful for that. Within 6 months, we were married. I know how that sounds. Impulsive, desperate, running towards something instead of away from something. Maybe it was both. David was good to me, though. He gave me a sense of normalcy I had been craving. We moved to San Diego and I got a job at a department store. I told him I had been married before, that I had a son, but that it hadn't worked out. I told him the truth was too complicated to explain. He accepted that. We never spoke about it again. I had another child with David in 1976, a daughter named Sarah. When she was born, I felt a desperate need to prove that I could be a good mother to her, that whatever had gone wrong with Michael wasn't some fundamental flaw in who I was. I threw myself into motherhood with Sarah in a way I never had with Michael. I was present. I was engaged. I was the mother I should have been to my first son. But every milestone Sarah reached, every word she spoke, every step she took, every moment of independence she gained, I thought about Michael. I wondered if he had reached those milestones too. I wondered if he was suffering because I wasn't there. I wondered if he hated me. The guilt manifested in strange ways. I would have nightmares where Michael was calling for me, screaming my name, and I couldn't reach him. I would wake up in cold sweats, my heart pounding, and David would hold me and ask what was wrong. I couldn't tell him. I didn't know how to explain that I was haunted by the ghost of a child I had abandoned, that no amount of love I poured into Sarah could fill the void where Michael should have been. I was running from myself, and I was failing at that too. In 1978, my mother called me again. This time, her voice was different. It was older, more tired. She told me that Michael was doing better than anyone expected. He was attending a special school in Santa Monica. He was learning to communicate, though his speech was still limited and difficult to understand. He was developing routines, finding comfort in structure and repetition. He was becoming a person, she said. He was becoming someone special. And she said something that broke me completely. He asks about you sometimes, Margaret. He doesn't understand why you're not here. He just knows something is missing. I hung up the phone after that call, and I went to the bathroom and I vomited. I sat on the tile floor of that bathroom for hours, and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since the day I left him. Sarah was sleeping in the next room. David was at work, and I was alone with the full weight of what I had done. That night, I made a decision to write my mother a letter. I told her to tell Michael that I loved him, that leaving him was never his fault, that I was broken and scared, and that was no excuse for what I had done. I asked her to keep the letter for him, to give it to him when he was old enough to understand. I never knew if she actually did that. The years between 1978 and 1990 were a strange kind of purgatory. David and I had another child, a son named Christopher, and I continued to live this double life of being present with my living children while being haunted by the ghost of my firstborn. I would see children with autism at the grocery store or at church, and I would study them intensely, wondering if that was what Michael looked like now, wondering if that was how he moved through the world. I subscribed to parenting magazines and kept every article about autism hidden in a box in the back of my closet. I was trying to understand my son from a distance, trying to know him without knowing him. I never told Sarah or Christopher about Michael. That was another burden I carried, the knowledge that I had half-siblings they didn't know about, a brother they would never meet because of my choices. I was depriving them of a relationship with their older brother, and I was depriving Michael of siblings who should have known and loved him. The ripples of my decision kept spreading outward, affecting everyone around me in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. David and I divorced in 1985. He was a good man, but our marriage was built on lies and avoidance, and eventually that foundation crumbled. He never knew the real reason I was so emotionally distant, so prone to melancholy and unexpected tears. I never gave him the chance to understand. After the divorce, I moved back to California, back to the state I had fled all those years ago, and I got a job as a receptionist at a law firm in Los Angeles. I lived in a small apartment in Silver Lake, and I existed in a kind of suspended animation. I was going through the motions of being alive, but I wasn't really living. It was during this period that I started going to therapy. My therapist, Dr. Harris, was an older woman with gray hair and kind eyes, and she seemed genuinely interested in understanding the root of my depression and anxiety. I told her about Michael, but I didn't tell her everything. I told her that I had made a mistake as a young mother, that I had chosen my own needs over my child's, and that I had regrets. She nodded and made notes in her leather notebook, and she asked me gentle questions about why I thought I had made that choice, what I had been running from, whether I had ever considered trying to make amends. I wasn't ready to answer those questions then. I was still running. I was still pretending that time and distance could erase what I had done. But therapy planted a seed, and slowly, over the next several years, that seed would begin to grow. If you were in my situation back then, facing that kind of fear and uncertainty, what would you have done differently? I want to hear from you in the comments. Don't hold back. Be honest with me. By the time the 1990s rolled around, I was in my 40s, and something inside me had shifted. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was the accumulation of years spent running. Maybe it was the realization that I couldn't outrun my own conscience forever. I had started attending church again after decades away, and I found myself drawn to the idea of redemption, to the possibility that even someone like me, someone who had committed such an unforgivable act, might somehow find a way to make peace with her past. Sarah was a teenager by then, beautiful and confident in ways I had never been. Christopher was in middle school, smart and athletic and everything a mother could hope for. They were good kids, and they had turned out well despite having a mother who was emotionally fragmented and haunted by secrets. But I knew they sensed something was wrong with me. Sarah would ask me sometimes why I seemed sad for no reason, why I would stare out the window for hours lost in thought. I would tell her it was nothing, that it was just my moods, that it had nothing to do with her or her brother. But she knew. Children always know when something is broken in their parents. In 1992, I got a call from my mother. She was 78 years old and her health was declining. She had emphysema from years of smoking and she wanted to see me. She said it was important. She said there were things we needed to talk about before it was too late. I drove up to Santa Monica that weekend and I sat in her small house overlooking the Pacific Ocean. And she told me about Michael's life, the real story, not the sanitized version I had constructed in my imagination. My mother told me that Michael had been a difficult child in many ways. His autism was severe. He didn't speak until he was almost 5 years old, and even then his speech was limited and often unintelligible to strangers. He had violent meltdowns when his routines were disrupted. He would bang his head against walls. He would scream for hours. He was afraid of loud noises, of crowds, of most of the things that made up the normal world. But he was also, my mother said, capable of profound love and connection. He had learned to read. He had learned to paint. He had developed a musical ear that was almost supernatural. He could listen to a song once and reproduce it on the piano, note for note. When Michael turned 18, my mother had fought to get him into a residential program in Pasadena that specialized in helping young adults with autism develop life skills and independence. He had been living there for years now, my mother told me. He had a job working at a grocery store, stocking shelves. He had friends, other residents and staff members who cared for him deeply. He was happy in his way. He had built a life. But here was the thing that broke my heart. Michael had asked about me, not constantly, and not in the way a typical child might ask about an absent parent, but sometimes, usually around his birthday or around the holidays, he would ask his caregivers where his mother was, why she didn't visit, if she ever thought about him. And no one had known what to tell him. My mother had never given him the letter I wrote, because she hadn't known how to explain my absence in a way that would make sense to him. She had just told him that I was busy, that sometimes parents had to go away, that it wasn't his fault. He had seemed to accept that explanation, but I could tell from the way my mother was speaking that this uncertainty had weighed on him too. My mother reached over and took my hand. She was fragile, her skin papery and soft, her grip weak. She told me that she was dying, and when she was gone there would be no one to advocate for Michael, except the state, except the system. She told me that Michael deserved to know the truth about his mother before she died. She told me that I owed it to him to face what I had done. I remember sitting there, my mother's hand in mine, and feeling like the floor was opening up beneath me. I wasn't ready. I would never be ready. But my mother was right. Michael deserved to know the truth. Michael deserved to have a choice about whether to forgive me or not. He deserved to have that agency, that power, even if I didn't deserve his forgiveness. My mother died 6 months later, in January of 1993. She was 79 years old. I was at her bedside when she passed, along with her hospice nurse. Her last words to me were, "Go to Michael, tell him everything, let him decide." I held her hand as she took her last breath, and I felt something shift inside me. For decades, I had been running from the truth, hiding from my own guilt and shame. But my mother's final words were like a key turning in a lock. They unlocked something in me, not forgiveness exactly, but acceptance. Acceptance that I could no longer hide, acceptance that I had to face the consequences of my choices, and that Michael had the right to know exactly who his mother was and why she had abandoned him. The funeral was 3 days later, and I moved through it like a ghost. My siblings came, though we weren't particularly close. They knew my story, or at least they knew the sanitized version I had been telling for years. I could see the judgment in their eyes too. Margaret, the one who had run away. Margaret, who had left her autistic son behind like yesterday's trash. I had become a kind of cautionary tale in my own family, the warning about what selfishness and cowardice could do to a life. After everyone left the cemetery, after all the condolences and the covered dishes and the uncomfortable silences, I sat alone in my mother's empty house in Santa Monica. I walked through the rooms where she had raised Michael, where she had cared for him, where she had fought so hard to give him a normal life despite his challenges. I found photographs in her albums, pictures of Michael as a child, as a young teenager, as he grew into adulthood. In every photo I could see the boy my mother had shaped, the man she had fought to make independent and capable. There were also drawings, dozens of them stacked in a box in my mother's bedroom. Michael had drawn them, she had saved them, and now they were mine to discover. Most of them were abstract, swirls of color, geometric patterns, things that came from Michael's unique way of seeing the world. But some of them were figures, and in many of those figures I could see a woman with long red hair. It was me. It was my own son's memory of me, preserved in pencil and crayon, a ghost image of the mother he had never really known. I sat on my mother's bed and I cried. I cried for my mother, for her sacrifice and her strength. I cried for Michael, for the childhood he had endured without his mother. But mostly I cried for myself, for the years I had wasted, for the person I had failed to become. That night, I made a phone call to the residential facility in Pasadena. I told whoever answered that I was Margaret Harris, that I was Michael's mother, and that I wanted to visit him. The person on the phone sounded surprised, maybe even skeptical. They said they would need to speak with Michael's caseworker, that they would need to make sure this visit wouldn't be disruptive to Michael's routine. I understood. I had forfeited my right to easy access to my son a long time ago. 2 days later, after the funeral arrangements were finalized and my mother's affairs were beginning to be settled, I drove to Pasadena. I drove slowly, taking back roads instead of the highway, delaying the moment of reckoning as long as I could. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. The facility was a pleasant-looking building surrounded by manicured lawns and gardens. There were other residents outside, some sitting on benches, some walking with staff members. It looked like a nice place. It looked like somewhere my mother would have chosen for Michael. But knowing it was nice didn't ease the weight of my guilt. If anything, it made it worse. My mother had done what I should have done. My mother had built him a life. I sat in my car in the parking lot for almost an hour before I could gather the courage to go inside. The whole time, I kept thinking about turning around, getting back in my car, driving back to Los Angeles and pretending this was all a bad dream. I was terrified. What if he hated me? What if he didn't remember me at all, didn't know who I was? What if I was just another stranger coming to disrupt his carefully constructed world? What if I caused him pain just by showing up? What if, after all these years, I was making the biggest mistake of my life? But my mother's last words echoed in my mind. Go to Michael. Tell him everything. Let him decide. I got out of the car. A young woman named Jennifer, one of Michael's caseworkers, met with me first in a small office inside the facility. I explained who I was, and I could see the moment understanding dawned on her face. She was kind, but there was also judgment in her eyes. I deserved that judgment. I had earned it through decades of absence and neglect. Jennifer sat across from me, and she told me things about Michael that I desperately needed to hear. She told me that Michael had spoken very little about his mother over the years, but that he had always remembered the smell of lavender soap, the soap I used to wear when he was an infant. She told me that he sometimes drew pictures of a woman with red hair, and she showed me some of these drawings. Michael's own hair was blonde like his father's, but he was remembering me. Some part of him, some deep cellular memory, was carrying that image of me, even after all these years of separation. We set up a visit for the following Saturday. I spent the entire week in a state of panic and preparation. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I obsessed over every detail, every word I might say, every possible reaction Michael might have. I bought Michael gifts. I didn't know what kind of music he liked anymore, or what his interests were, so I bought a variety of things. I bought cassette tapes with classical music and pop music. I bought art supplies, colored pencils, sketchbooks, watercolors. I bought a warm sweater because I thought he might get cold. I bought all these things as if material objects could somehow compensate for 19 years of absence, as if a gift could bridge the canyon between us. When Saturday came, I drove back to Pasadena with my heart in my throat. Jennifer met me in the common area of the facility, and then Michael came through the door. He was 19 years old, and he looked nothing like I expected and exactly like I imagined all at once. He had my eyes, that pale blue that ran through my family. He was tall and thin, with blonde hair that fell across his forehead. He moved with a kind of careful deliberation, as if he was always aware of where his body was in space, always thinking about each motion before he made it. He didn't recognize me at first. He looked at me with curiosity, but no connection, and that was almost worse than if he had shown anger or rejection. Jennifer gently explained who I was, speaking in a calm, clear voice. "Michael, this is Margaret. She's your mother. She's come to visit you." Michael tilted his head, and I watched something move across his face. Recognition, maybe, or confusion. His lips moved, and he made a sound, not quite a word, but something close. Jennifer said his name gently and asked him if he wanted to sit down with his mother. He nodded, and we sat at a table in the common room, surrounded by other residents and staff members, and I looked at this young man, my son, and I didn't know what to say. "I need you to subscribe to this channel right now. There are so many more stories like this one that I need to share with you. Stories of parents who ran away, stories of children who were left behind, stories of the possibility of redemption. Subscribe now, so you don't miss a single moment of what comes next in Michael's story." That first visit lasted only 30 minutes, though it felt like hours. Michael and I sat across from each other at that table, and I tried to make conversation, but my words felt clumsy and false. I asked him about his job at the grocery store. He gave one-word answers, mostly monosyllables that Jennifer had to interpret for me sometimes. I told him about my life, about Sarah and Christopher, about the work I was doing. He listened, but I couldn't tell if any of it was reaching him, if any of it mattered to him. When Jennifer finally said it was time for Michael to go back to his activity group, he stood up without any sign of emotion and walked away without looking back. I sat alone at that table for a long time after he left, and I cried. I cried for the time I had lost with him, for the moments we would never have, for the fact that even now, even after coming back, even after deciding to face what I had done, I couldn't bridge the gap that my own selfishness had created. I had expected some kind of recognition, some kind of connection that would validate my decision to finally confront him, but Michael didn't owe me that. He didn't owe me anything. I started visiting Michael every Saturday after that. For months, I came to that facility, and every visit was essentially the same. Michael would sit with me. We would talk, or rather, I would talk and Michael would listen. Sometimes he would respond, sometimes he wouldn't. Slowly, though, something began to shift. He started to remember me. One day, about 3 months into my visits, he said my name. Not Margaret, but Ma. And hearing that word come from his mouth after nearly 20 years of silence broke something open inside me. Jennifer told me that Michael had started asking about me on the days I wasn't there. He would ask her when his mother was coming. He would ask if I was real or if he was imagining me. It seemed that even for someone with autism, with all the communication challenges and the difficulty processing social interaction, the bond between mother and child was something fundamental and real. He was trying to understand me. He was trying to understand why I had come back. About 6 months into my visits, I decided it was time to tell him the truth. I had consulted with Jennifer and with a therapist specializing in autism, and they both said that Michael was intelligent and perceptive enough to understand, even if he couldn't express his understanding in typical ways. They said that honesty was important, that he deserved to know why I had left, even if it was painful. On a Saturday afternoon in September of 1993, I sat down with Michael in a quieter room that the facility had set aside for us. Jennifer was nearby, but not in the room with us. I held Michael's hand and I told him everything. I told him that I was young and scared when he was born. I told him that I didn't know how to be a mother to a child with special needs. I told him that I was selfish and broken and that I had run away instead of staying and learning how to love him properly. I told him that leaving him was not his fault. I told him that there was nothing wrong with him, that he was perfect exactly as he was. I told him that I had spent nearly 20 years regretting what I had done, that I had thought about him every single day, that I had loved him from a distance because I was too much of a coward to love him face to face. Michael listened to all of this without changing his expression much. His eyes moved around the room, not making direct contact with me, which was typical for him, but his hand remained in mine, and he didn't pull away. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then Michael looked at me directly, something he rarely did, and he said, "Ma sad?" It was simple. It was profound. He was asking if I was sad. He was recognizing my pain. He was showing me empathy across the vast canyon of years and trauma and miscommunication. I nodded, and I said yes, I was sad. I was very sad. And then Michael did something I will remember for the rest of my life. He reached over and patted my hand, the way you might comfort a small child. He made a sound, a kind of humming noise, and I realized he was trying to soothe me. I broke down completely. I cried harder than I had ever cried in my life, and Michael just sat there, patting my hand, humming, and I understood in that moment that despite everything I had done, despite all my failures, Michael had the capacity to love me. Not because I deserved it, but because that's who he was. He was a person capable of unconditional love, and I had almost thrown that away forever. After that visit, things began to change between us. Michael became more engaged during my visits. He started showing me things, paintings he had made, songs he had learned on the piano. There was one song in particular that he loved, a Chopin nocturne that was heartbreakingly beautiful. He would play it, and I would sit and listen, and I would feel like he was telling me something he couldn't say with words. I learned that Michael had a very specific routine, and he didn't like when that routine was disrupted. I learned that he had a fear of certain textures and certain sounds. I learned that he was a person, fully realized and complete, and I had missed 19 years of knowing him. As time went on, Jennifer and the other staff members at the facility began to share more details about Michael's life with me. They told me about his work ethic at the grocery store, how he was reliable and consistent and took pride in doing his job well. They told me about his friendships with other residents, how he looked out for them, how he had a protective instinct toward people who were vulnerable. They told me that he was an example to others at the facility, that he showed people what was possible when you were given structure and support and genuine care. I was learning who my son was, finally, and he was better than I had any right to hope for. I was also learning who I was, a woman who had done something terrible, but who had the possibility of redemption, not because Michael forgave me completely, but because I was choosing to show up every single Saturday and be present in his life going forward. One day in the spring of 1994, almost a year after I had come back into his life, Michael did something that surprised everyone. He was in the common area, and some of the other residents and staff were sitting around. Someone asked him about his family, and Michael said clearly, "My ma, she comes Saturdays." It was one of the longest sentences he had ever spoken, and Jennifer told me later that the room had gone silent. Michael was claiming me. After everything, after all my years of absence, he was acknowledging me as his mother. I brought Sarah and Christopher to meet Michael that summer. I had finally told them the truth about their older brother, and they had reacted with a mixture of shock and sadness and anger toward me for keeping this secret for so long. But when they met Michael, something shifted in them too. Sarah, who was in college by then, felt a protective instinct toward him. Christopher, who was 14, seemed almost in awe of him. They asked if they could come back and visit again, and Michael seemed pleased by their presence, even if he didn't express it in typical ways. I realized during that visit that I had deprived Michael of siblings. I had deprived Sarah and Christopher of a brother. I had deprived all of us of the family we could have been. But sitting there in that common room, watching my 3 children interact with each other in their own unique ways, I felt something like hope. It wasn't redemption. Redemption was too grand a word for what I had earned. But it was a beginning. It was a chance to be part of his life, to be part of their lives going forward. The years between 1994 and 2000 were quiet years in some ways. I continued to visit Michael every Saturday without fail. I took early retirement from my job at the law firm so that I could have more time with my children and grandchildren as they came along. I became involved in advocacy work for autism awareness, something I should have done decades earlier. I volunteered at the facility where Michael lived, reading to residents, helping with activities, doing the work of care that I had been too afraid to do when Michael was an infant. Michael's life continued to improve in small ways. When he turned 25, he and another resident named Tommy, a young man with Down syndrome, moved into a supervised apartment together. They had staff support during the week, and they learned to manage their own lives in ways that gave them a sense of independence and dignity. I helped Michael set up his apartment. I bought him furniture and kitchen supplies, and I showed him how to organize things in ways that made sense to his mind. But as the year 2000 approached, something began to happen that I hadn't anticipated. My health started to decline. I was in my late 50s by then, But I had lived a hard life, emotionally speaking, and it was starting to catch up with me. I had a heart condition that required medication. I had arthritis in my hands. I developed high blood pressure from years of stress and anxiety, and I became acutely aware of my own mortality in a way I never had before. I started to panic about what would happen to Michael when I was gone. I had made amends with him, yes, but I was still his mother, still the person he had learned to depend on. What if something happened to me? What if he lost me again, this time permanently? The thought of him going through that loss, of him having to process grief and abandonment all over again, was almost unbearable. Please like this video. I know you're feeling the weight of this story, the emotion of it. Please give it a thumbs up. It helps us reach more people who need to hear that redemption is possible, that forgiveness can happen, that it's never too late to come home. The year 2000 arrived with a sense of finality that I couldn't ignore. I was 62 years old and I was running out of time. Not immediately, but the awareness was there, pressing against me like a hand on my chest. I started to think seriously about what kind of legacy I wanted to leave for Michael. I had already changed my will to make sure that he would be taken care of financially after I was gone. But money wasn't enough. He needed continuity. He needed the people in his life to understand his story, to understand where he came from, to understand the arc of his life and my role in it. I started writing letters to Michael. I know it sounds strange, writing letters to someone you see every week, but these weren't ordinary letters. These were letters explaining things he might need to know someday. I wrote about his birth, about his father Robert, about the circumstances of his childhood. I wrote about my guilt and my growth. I wrote about the things I wished I could have done differently and the things I was grateful I had managed to do right. I sealed these letters and gave them to Jennifer, asking her to hold on to them for Michael, to give them to him when the time was right. In 2001, about 8 years after I had come back into Michael's life, something unexpected happened. Robert, Michael's biological father, reached out to me. I hadn't heard from him in nearly 30 years. He had remarried after our divorce, had lived a quiet life, and had carried his own regrets about Michael. He wanted to know if it was possible to meet his son. He wanted to apologize for the years he had missed, for not fighting harder to keep Michael in his life after I left. I was hesitant at first. I didn't know what impact meeting Robert would have on Michael, but I consulted with Jennifer and the other professionals at the facility, and they thought it might be positive. They thought that Michael deserved to know his father, to understand that he came from two people and that both of us had failed him in different ways, but that both of us had come to regret those failures. The meeting between Michael and Robert happened on a Saturday afternoon in the spring of 2001. I was there, and so was Jennifer, and we sat in that same quiet room where I had told Michael the truth about why I had left him. Robert was older than I remembered, his hair gray, his face lined with age and regret. He looked at Michael with an intensity that made me understand finally how much he had loved this child all along, how much the absence had cost him. Robert told Michael that he was his father, that he had loved him from the moment he was born, that he was sorry he hadn't been there. Michael listened, and then he did something that none of us expected. He reached over and took Robert's hand, just as he had taken mine so many times, and Robert cried. He sat there and cried like a man whose heart was breaking and healing at the same time. After that day, Robert started visiting Michael too. We would sometimes run into each other at the facility on Saturday afternoons, and we would sit together with Michael, Three people bound together by decades of regret and finally, slowly, by something that might have been forgiveness. Robert and I never rekindled anything romantic. That was long past, but we became something like friends, connected by our shared love for this remarkable young man who had survived our failures and come out whole on the other side. The early 2000s were good years. Michael continued to thrive in his supervised apartment. His job at the grocery store led to better employment opportunities, and he eventually found work at a local library, shelving books and helping with organization. He was good at it. He was precise and careful, and his supervisor told me that Michael was one of the most reliable employees they had ever had. He had built a life. He had built meaning. But I was also getting older, and my health was becoming more fragile. In 2004, I had a serious heart attack. I spent a week in the hospital, and I had a lot of time to think about mortality and legacy and the finite nature of time. When I got out of the hospital, I made a decision that I had been circling around for years. I decided to tell Michael's story publicly, not for myself. I didn't deserve redemption or forgiveness from strangers, but for Michael and for other children like him, and for other mothers like me who had run away from their responsibilities. I started speaking at autism awareness events. I told my story, the full story, holding nothing back. I talked about my youth and my fear and my selfishness. I talked about the decades of regret. I talked about the slow, painful process of trying to make amends. And most importantly, I talked about Michael, about who he was, about his capabilities, and his worth and his right to be loved unconditionally by his mother. People responded to my story in ways I didn't expect. Other parents of children with autism reached out to me, many of them struggling with feelings I understood intimately, the overwhelm, the fear, the sense that they were failing. I told them what I had learned, that running away didn't help, that the guilt didn't fade with time, that the only way through was to face what you had done and to commit to being present no matter how hard it was. I told them that their children were worthy of love, that they were capable of extraordinary things, that they deserved parents who showed up for them every single day. In 2006, Michael turned 33 years old, the same age Jesus was when he died, I remember thinking. Michael had survived 33 years of life, the first 19 of them without his mother, and he was still here, still loving, still growing. We had a birthday party for him at the facility, and Sarah and Christopher came with their families. Michael's grandchildren, my grandchildren, were there, and they sang happy birthday with such genuine affection that I wept. Michael didn't fully understand the concept of birthdays, but he understood that it was a day to celebrate, a day when the people he loved gathered around him. He understood that he mattered. That was what my presence over all these years had finally taught him. He mattered. He was worthy of being celebrated. He was worthy of love. The last years of my life, and I'm getting close to the end now, at 72, have been marked by a kind of peace that I didn't think was possible for someone like me. I still regret what I did. I still think about the years I missed, the moments I wasn't there for. But I have also come to understand that regret without action is just self-pity. I acted. I came back. I showed up. I made amends as best as I could. Michael has forgiven me, though not in the way typical people forgive. He has accepted me into his life. He calls me on the phone sometimes with help from his staff, and he asks when I'm coming to visit. He has introduced me to his friends as his mother, with a kind of pride that makes my heart ache. He has allowed me to be part of his story, not as the woman who abandoned him, but as the woman who came home. Last month, I took Michael to the ocean in Santa Monica, to the place where his grandmother used to live, where I had left him all those years ago. We walked along the beach, and Michael stopped and looked at the water, and he took my hand. He didn't say anything. Words were never his strength, but he didn't need to. I understood. We were home. Both of us finally had come home. I know my time is running short. My doctor says I probably have a few more good years, maybe longer if I'm lucky. But however much time I have left, I'm committed to spending as much of it as possible with Michael. I'm committed to being the mother I should have been from the beginning. I'm committed to making sure that when I die, he knows he was loved, that he was wanted, that his life has meant something. To anyone watching this who has abandoned a child, whether that child has special needs or not, I'm begging you to consider coming home. It's never too late. The pain of facing what you've done will be real, and it will be intense, but it will also be a pathway to redemption. Your child deserves to know you. They deserve to have the chance to forgive you, even if forgiveness takes years. They deserve to have their mother or father in their life, not as a ghost or a wound, but as a real person, showing up, being present, doing the work of love. To anyone watching this who is the parent of a child with special needs and who is struggling, I want you to know that you are stronger than you think you are, that your child is more capable than you can imagine, that the life you build together, even when it's hard, even when it's nothing like you planned, can be beautiful and meaningful and full of love. My name is Margaret, and I abandoned my autistic son 40 years ago, but I also came back. And that is the story that defines me now. Share this video with someone you know who needs to hear this message. Share it with someone who has run away from their responsibilities. Share it with someone who is struggling to accept a child with special needs. Share it with someone who has lost hope. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is tell our story and let others know that they are not alone. Michael is now 39 years old. He still works at the library. He still lives in his supervised apartment with his friend Tommy. He still plays the piano, and that Chopin Nocturne is still his favorite piece. Every Saturday I visit him. Every Saturday we sit together and I get to be his mother. Every Saturday I get to show up for the person I should have been there for from the very beginning. If you're out there and you've made a mistake like I have, if you've run away from someone who needed you, please know that it's not too late. Come home, face what you've done. Ask for forgiveness, not because you deserve it, but because the other person deserves to have you in their life. That's what I learned. That's what Michael taught me. Without even trying, thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for bearing witness to my regret and my redemption. And please, if you have a child or a loved one with special needs, hold them close. Tell them that they matter. Tell them that they are worthy of love, because they are. Don't forget to watch the next story on this channel. There's another parent out there, another child, another chance at redemption waiting for you to hear it.